It was late afternoon in Calico Ridge, the autumn of 1888. The wind carried that sharp, cold bite that warned winter was coming, but down in the marketplace, the air hung heavy and still with dust. Usually, market day was the busiest time of the week, full of noise and trade. But today, the atmosphere had twisted into something darker. The center of town was packed tight with farmers, traders, and elders, men and women who thought they had seen every sin a person could commit. But they had gathered here for a different kind of spectacle. In the middle of the square stood Elsie Ray Holloway. Her wrists were bound tight behind her back, her ankles locked in heavy iron shackles. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, and her dress, once clean, was stained with the dirt of travel. In the harsh afternoon light, a crude sign hung around her neck, the ink scrawled in rough, angry letters: "Conwoman, liar, baby thief." The crowd pressing in around her was thick. Some people pointed and sneered, while others crossed their arms, watching in a grim, heavy silence. A few of the older women whispered prayers, though if you looked in their eyes, you saw judgment, not mercy. A stout woman near the front flicked an apple rind at Elsie's feet and spat out, "You'd steal a newborn from its own blood? What kind of creature are you?" The noise of the crowd began to rise. Rumors about the vanished Montrose family had spread like wildfire through Calico Ridge. The wealthy landowners had simply disappeared weeks ago without a trace. Then, locals stumbled upon a newborn child in a lonely shack by the creek, with Elsie inside, tending to the baby as if she were its own mother. At first, it looked like an act of kindness, but when Elsie couldn't produce a single witness or document to back up her story, suspicion wrapped around her like a chokehold. She claimed the Montroses had entrusted the child to her. She insisted they gave her a letter, a document granting her temporary guardianship. But no one in that square had seen this letter, and in a town where land, legacy, and lineage meant everything, the townspeople jumped to the simplest, most damning conclusion. She had made the story up to seize the child and claim the Montrose estate for herself. Elsie stood there without making a sound. She didn't beg, she didn't wail, she didn't scream that she was innocent. She simply stared straight ahead, her face pale but composed. Ironically, that silence convinced people she was guilty. An innocent woman would fight, they whispered. An innocent woman would scream. Standing at the very edge of the crowd was Jonas Vance. He was 32 years old, lean and hardened from years of work on the Blackstone Ranch. His boots still caked with morning mud. He stood with his hands buried deep in his coat pockets, not speaking, not condemning. His expression was unreadable in the bright sun. He was the only man in Calico Ridge who had seen a different side of Elsie. He remembered a stormy night 6 weeks earlier when she had come to his door, soaked to the bone and desperate, holding a crumpled piece of paper, begging him to read it. He remembered that letter clearly. In fact, it was currently folded and hidden in his private chest back at the ranch. Jonas was the only witness who could prove her story was true. But to produce that letter would mean revealing more than just her innocence. The letter spoke of fear and a hasty escape. The Montroses had fled the law after some shady land deals collapsed. It contained a desperate plea for Elsie to care for their infant daughter until the trouble passed. But buried in the margins was a name that made Jonas's stomach drop his own. The letter hinted that he was the illegitimate son of Mr. Montrose, a truth Jonas had never shared with a soul. If Jonas brought the letter forward, if he confirmed it was real, he would be revealing his own origins. He would unravel every bit of respectability he had painstakingly earned in Calico Ridge. He had worked the Blackstone Ranch from dawn to dusk, building a reputation on honest labor, refusing to lean on family ties even if they existed. So he stood in the back and watched. He didn't shout. He didn't step in. As the townspeople jeered and judged her, Elsie's silence didn't help her case. It made her look guiltier. And Jonas's silence bore witness not to doubt, but to fear. In that moment, while the sun beat down and dust swirled around their boots, a woman stood condemned not because of evidence, but because the one man who knew the truth refused to speak it. The rain that night had been relentless, a steady, soaking drizzle that turned the road from the chapel to Blackstone Ranch into a river of mud. The horses were already stabled, and the lanterns in the main house had been dimmed low. Jonas Vance had just finished his evening meal when the knock echoed through the quiet house. He opened the heavy oak door to find a figure that looked as if she had walked through a hurricane. It was Elsie Ray Holloway, drenched to the bone, clutching a bundle tightly against her chest. Her dark hair was plastered to her face, and water pooled around her boots on the porch floorboards. She didn't wait to be invited in. She simply looked up at him, her eyes wide with terror and exhaustion. "They told me to trust you," she whispered, her voice trembling against the sound of the rain. "They wrote it in the letter, and they left the baby with me." She practically shoved the bundle into his arms. It was a child, no more than a few weeks old. Surprisingly silent and warm, fast asleep despite the storm. Jonas blinked, trying to process the scene, but before he could ask a single question, Elsie reached into her coat. She pulled out a folded piece of paper, damp from the journey, and handed it to him with a quiet, desperate urgency. He took the paper and stepped back, allowing her into the warmth of the room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, the only sound in the tense room. Jonas crouched near the flames, carefully unfolding the damp paper to avoid tearing it. The ink had run in a few spots, but the signature at the bottom was unmistakable. Eleanor Montrose. He read the letter in silence, his heart hammering against his ribs. Eleanor's words were hurried, written in panic. She explained that her family had been forced to flee Calico Ridge immediately to escape an investigation into their fraudulent land deals. She expressed deep gratitude to Elsie, entrusting the young woman with the care of their infant daughter. But it was the final few lines that made the room spin around Jonas. Eleanor revealed a secret that Jonas had never spoken aloud, a truth buried deep beneath the polite surface of the town. The letter stated clearly that he was the illegitimate son of Everett Montrose. Jonas's jaw tightened until it ached. His fingers curled around the damp paper. He looked up at Elsie, who stood shivering by the door, water dripping from her hem. Her face was calm now, but her eyes begged him to believe her, to take action. But Jonas didn't move. He said nothing. He asked her to wait outside on the porch for just a moment, and once she was gone, he turned back to the room alone. From a drawer in his desk, he pulled out a second letter, a duplicate Elsie had brought as a precaution, and stared at it. Then, without a word, he struck a match. He held the flame to the edge of the paper and watched it curl and blacken, turning into ash before it hit the floor. He kept the original, tucking it away in a heavy wooden box under lock and key. He didn't do it for safekeeping, and he certainly didn't do it for justice. He did it out of fear. "I can't let this come out," he whispered to the empty room. "If the town finds out I'm a Montrose bastard, they'll take everything, my land, my name, my life." He convinced himself he was preserving order. He told himself that when the Montroses eventually returned, the truth would sort itself out. It wasn't his job to fix the mess they had made. But as the days turned into weeks, Jonas found himself riding past the old chapel where the baby had been found, and every night the talk in town grew louder and uglier. People said Elsie had lost her mind. They claimed she had fabricated the entire story, inventing a letter no one had ever seen. They stripped her of her dignity, locking her up without food. Yet they marveled that she never shed a tear. Jonas said nothing, but he couldn't forget the rain, the absolute trust in her voice, or the way she had looked at him as if he were the last honest man on earth. Now, in the silence of his barn or the creak of saddle leather on a lonely morning ride, he saw her face. He had taken her trust and buried it beneath his own cowardice. She had handed him the truth, and he had chosen to mute it. Now the town called her a liar, and she stood entirely alone. And Jonas Vance, the only man alive who knew she was innocent, felt the weight of his silence growing heavier with every passing hour. The county courthouse had never seen a crowd like this. Every wooden chair was occupied, and men stood shoulder to shoulder along the back walls, clutching their hats in sweaty hands. The air was thick with the smell of damp wool and unwashed bodies, and whispers flew round the room like sparks from a dying fire. The town council had called this emergency hearing after a rumor leaked that Jonas Vance, the stoic owner of Blackstone Ranch, intended to testify on behalf of the accused. Woman. Jonas stood in the center of the room, an island of calm in the chaos. Two deputies flanked him, looking unsure whether they were there to protect him or arrest him. He hadn't bothered with a hat. His shirt was clean but wrinkled, looking as though he had dressed in a hurry, his mind miles away, in his hands. He held the letter. It was dry now, carefully pressed between sheets of waxed linen to save the fading ink. He held it with a reverence usually reserved for scripture. "I have something to read," Jonas announced, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "This is a letter written by Eleanor Montrose, dated 3 weeks before she and her husband fled this town." A heavy hush fell over the room. You could hear the floorboards creak as people leaned forward. Jonas unfolded the paper. He began to read, his voice steady and deliberate, ensuring every word reached the back of the room. He read a mother's desperate plea, entrusting her infant daughter to Elsie Ray Holloway. He read her praise of Elsie's character, her request for the town to show mercy if the family failed to return. The letter laid it all bare, a land scheme that had collapsed, a scandal that threatened to ruin innocent lives, and a terrified plan to vanish. And then Jonas reached the final lines. He paused, took a breath, and read the words that would change his life forever. "Jonas Vance is to be trusted. He has more right to the Montrose name than most who carry it." For a moment, the silence was absolute. It was deeper than shock. Then the murmurs started, low and angry. "He's claiming to be a Montrose," someone hissed. "He's lying. He's after the land. Mr. Baylor, a local trader known for his loud opinions and even louder debts, jumped to his feet. "This is mighty convenient, don't you think?" he barked, pointing a shaking finger at Jonas. "A bastard child suddenly appears with a miracle letter just in time to save the woman. He's sweet on. He isn't proving her innocence, Mayor. He's trying to steal an inheritance." Jonas didn't flinch, even as the accusation hung in the air. From the back of the room, Mrs. Stoddard, the grocer's wife, chimed in, her voice sharp and cruel. "She fooled him. He's under her spell. Who knows, maybe she's carrying his child next." Laughter rippled through the crowd, ugly, sharp, and mocking. Jonas raised his voice, shouting over the din, "I am not here to claim land. I am here because I let a lie grow bigger than my fear." But the crowd wasn't listening anymore. The mayor leaned forward from his high bench, his face stern. "Mr. Vance," he rumbled, "without corroborating evidence, without the Montroses themselves standing here, this letter is nothing more than paper. It could have been written by anyone. We cannot, and will not, let hearsay overturn the safety and order of this town." Elsie was seated near the rear door, shackles still binding her wrists. Throughout the entire spectacle, she hadn't cried. Her face remained a mask of stone, but her eyes, usually so fierce, had gone dim. She looked at Jonas for a long, agonizing moment. "I told you," she said, her voice quiet, but carrying across the sudden silence near the front. "The truth can't save anyone if they don't want it." Jonas opened his mouth to argue, but the words died in his throat. He had braved public humiliation. He had torn open a secret he had guarded for decades and placed it in the hands of people he thought would value justice, but they had already decided what they wanted to believe. They didn't want the truth. They wanted a villain. They believed she had seduced him. They believed the baby was a prop. They believed that truth had to look shiny and clean to be real, and Elsie was too quiet, too ragged, too stubborn. The council moved to postpone the final judgment, promising to investigate further, but the verdict was already written on their faces. As Jonas stepped down from the stand, the room was cold. No one nodded. Even the deputies averted their eyes. He walked past Elsie, and for the first time, she didn't look up at him. In that crushing stillness, Jonas realized the bitter reality. It wasn't the truth they had rejected. It was her. The wind sweeping through Calico Ridge that night carried a bite colder than usual for early autumn, as if the town itself was holding its breath before a disaster. The streets were deserted, windows shuttered tight against the dark, and the lamps were dimmed low. But inside the main house of Blackstone Ranch, the silence was deafening. Jonas Vance hadn't slept. He hadn't eaten since the hearing. His boots were still caked with mud from the fields, but his mind was miles away, stuck on the memory of Elsie's voice in that courtroom. Tomorrow morning, They were going to take her away. The realization gnawed at him. He had failed her with words, so now the only thing left was action. Under the cover of a moonless sky, Jonas saddled his horse in the dark, refusing to light a lantern. Dressed in black with a worn bandana around his neck, he packed only the essentials: a coil of sturdy rope, a sharp leather trimming knife, and the heavy guilt that had settled in his gut like a stone. He rode out quietly, sticking to the shadows and skirting the edge of town to avoid the main road. The jail stood at the southern end of the ridge, a squat, ugly building made of rough stone and iron. 2 deputies were posted out front, a lantern swaying lazily in the breeze. Jonas watched them from the darkness of the livery stable across the street, timing their movements. When they turned to talk, he moved, approaching from the blind side. Jonas crept up to the small iron grate that led to the lower holding cells. He crouched in the dirt. Pulling the knife from his belt, he jammed the tip into the lock of the supply hatch, a small opening used for passing food trays. The metal groaned, rusted and stiff. His heart hammered in his ears, drowning out the wind. Finally, a soft click. The lock gave way. He slipped his hand inside, fingers brushing the latch of the side gate. But just as he started to pull it open, a voice barked out from the darkness. "Hey, who goes there?" Jonas didn't freeze. He spun around, meeting the first deputy head-on. He drove his shoulder into the man's chest, sending him stumbling back into the wall. A second guard came running, swinging a heavy club. Jonas ducked, using the momentum to throw the man over his hip. He fought with the raw, untrained strength of a rancher, instinctive and brutal. Years of breaking wild horses and wrestling cattle had made him tough. But 3 against 1 was a losing hand. A club caught him hard in the ribs, knocking the wind out of him. Another blow slammed into his jaw, sending a spray of light across his vision. He hit the ground hard, breath torn from his lungs. Inside the jail, Elsie heard the sickening thud of the struggle. "Jonas," her voice rang out, trembling with fear. The guards didn't answer her. Instead, they dragged her roughly from her cell, her dress snagging on the rough floor, her hands still bound. They threw her into the dirt beside him, as if she were nothing more than a sack of grain. "Looks like we found your hero," one of the deputies sneered, looming over them. Jonas tried to push himself up, blood trickling from his temple, but a boot to the back forced him down. They shackled them both, hauling them down into the sub-basement, the darkest, dampest cell reserved for violent drunks and forgotten vagrants. The air down here smelled of rot and wet earth. The heavy iron door slammed shut, leaving them in the dim flicker of a single oil lamp. Elsie dragged herself to the wall and sat with her knees pulled to her chest, her eyes wide with shock and a deep, aching sorrow. Jonas, breathing raggedly, managed to sit up against the cold stone. "I tried," he rasped, the words hurting his throat. "I know," she said softly. He turned to look at her, blood drying on his face. "I thought if I just told the truth, if I made them see it, they'd have to let you go. I thought I could fix what I broke." Her voice didn't waver. "The truth doesn't matter in a place like this, Jonas, not unless the right person says it. And I don't think that person is you." A heavy silence settled between them, broken only by the drip of water from the ceiling and the sound of their own breathing. After a long moment, Elsie leaned toward him, gently, using the tattered sleeve of her dress. She wiped the blood from his cheek. "You came anyway," she whispered. Jonas didn't answer. He didn't need to, in that filthy cell, with his dignity stripped away and bruises blooming on his skin. Something unspoken passed between them. It wasn't forgiveness, not yet, but it was understanding. And for the first time, they weren't just a people caught in a lie. They were in this together. The cell was freezing, constructed from rough, uneven stone blocks that seemed to suck the warmth right out of the earth. A solitary oil lamp sputtered in a rusted iron sconce, throwing long, nervous shadows that danced across the damp walls. There was no furniture to speak of, just a threadbare, moth-eaten blanket bundled in the corner and the heavy, suffocating silence hanging between them. Jonas Vance sat slumped against the far wall, his breathing shallow and careful. One hand was pressed tight against his side where a bruise was already blooming dark purple across his ribs. Dried blood had crusted over a nasty gash on his brow, a souvenir from the fight upstairs. Jonas wasn't a man used to losing. He didn't lose battles, he didn't lose control, and he certainly didn't lose his sense of self. But tonight, he had lost all three. He stared blankly at the stone floor for a long time before his voice finally broke the quiet, raw and scraping against the silence. "I wasn't afraid of losing the ranch," he admitted, the words barely audible. "And I wasn't even afraid of the town turning against me. I was afraid that once they knew the truth, once they knew who my father really was, they'd look at me and see what I really am. Nothing." Elsie sat across from him, knees pulled up to her chest, her arms wrapped tightly around her legs. Her dress was torn at the shoulder, her face pale and ghostly in the dim light. But when she spoke, her voice didn't tremble. "I know what that fear feels like," she said softly. "But do you want to know what hurt me the most? It wasn't being accused of stealing. It wasn't the humiliation of the square or being thrown in here." She turned her head, fixing him with a gaze that was tired but unwavering. "It was being abandoned by the one person I believed would actually stand up for me." Jonas closed his eyes. The shame of it burned hotter than the physical pain in his ribs. "I read that letter a dozen times," he murmured, shaking his head. "I nearly burned it the night you gave it to me, just like the copy. But I kept it. I told myself I kept it because maybe one day it would remind me not to be a coward." He let out a bitter, dry laugh. "But all it did was remind me that I already was one." The silence returned, heavy and thick, until Elsie's voice cut through it again. "I forgive you." "Jonas," he looked up sharply, genuine surprise etching his face. "But," she added, her eyes hardening just slightly, "I don't forgive the man who stayed silent while the truth was begging for air." Jonas didn't answer. He couldn't. She was right. And any defense would just be another lie. Elsie shifted, reaching into the torn pocket of her dress. She pulled out a small, frayed ribbon. It was pale blue and, miraculously, still carried the faint, sweet scent of lavender, a stark contrast to the rot of the cell. Without a word, she crawled across the dirty stone floor until she was kneeling beside him. Gently, she reached out and lifted the matted hair from his forehead. With slow, deliberate movements, she pressed the ribbon against the cut to stem the bleeding, her fingers brushing his skin like a whisper. Jonas sat frozen. It wasn't the pain that stunned him. It was the kindness. He didn't deserve it. Not from her. When she finished tying the makeshift bandage, he reached out and took her hand. He didn't grab it. He just rested his rough fingers against hers. It was a light touch, a silent question. Elsie didn't pull away. There were no grand declarations in that cell, no poetic vows of undying love. Just a people sitting in the dirt, stripped of their pride, bound not by the iron bars, but by the raw, ugly truth they finally shared. Jonas spoke again, his voice barely a whisper in the gloom. "I won't leave you again." She didn't reply verbally. Instead, she leaned her head back against the cold stone wall, just close enough that her shoulder pressed against his. She let herself feel his warmth. That was all the answer he needed. In that moment, in the dark, with nothing left to lose, the dynamic shifted. They were no longer rescuer and victim, no longer the liar and the witness. They were finally equals. Just two hearts broken open in the same quiet place. And maybe, just maybe, that was exactly where a love story like theirs had to begin. Today's. That was the deadline. The town council didn't waste any time. They posted the notices all over town before the ink was even dry. A federal judge from the regional circuit was due to arrive within 48 hours. His word would be law. No appeals, no delays, no second chances. If the charges stuck, Elsie wasn't just going to jail. She was being shipped off to a women's work colony in Wyoming or Kansas. Those were places where people went to disappear, where the sunlight barely touched the ground and names were forgotten in weeks. But the cruelest part was the child, the little girl Elsie had fought so hard to protect. The baby she had fed and rocked through feverish nights was now listed on the town registry as a ward of the state. The orphanage wagon was scheduled to roll into town the very same morning the judge banged his gavel. Jonas sat near the cell door, the official notice crinkling in his grip until his knuckles turned white. His heart hammered against his ribs like a war drum. He couldn't fight them with fists anymore. He had lost that battle. He had to fight them with the only thing he had left. That night, hunched over the scarred desk in the jail's side office by the light of a flickering lamp, Jonas dipped a pen into ink and started writing. It wasn't a long letter. To whom it may concern, he scratched out, his hand shaking slightly. I, Jonas Vance, confess to withholding evidence, concealing the truth, and misleading this town to save my own reputation. He didn't hold back. He took the blame for every false charge brought against Elsie. He demanded her release and petitioned for the right to care for the child himself. Then, he paused, dipped the pen again, and added one final, jagged line in darker ink. I do not deserve to be called a man if I stand by and let a child lose her mother for a second time. He folded the paper and sealed it with wax, stamping it with his family's old cattle brand, a symbol that still commanded respect in Calico Ridge. He walked back into the cold damp of the cell. Elsie was sitting on the floor, her back straight, against the stone, but the fire in her eyes had burned down to ash. She looked hollow. The fight hadn't left her. It had just been worn down to a nub. Jonas crouched beside her, his voice low in the quiet dark. They're coming for the baby, he said softly. It was a hard truth, but he wouldn't lie to her again. She didn't look up. She didn't speak. I wrote to the judge, he continued. I told him the whole truth. I'm taking the fall for this. That got her attention. She turned her head slowly, looking at him with red-rimmed eyes. Her voice cracked when she finally spoke. You think I'm crying for myself? Jonas paused, blinking. I'm crying, she whispered, the tears finally spilling over, because she has no voice. Even if I scream until my lungs bleed, they only hear lies. She buried her face in her hands, breaking down completely. It wasn't self-pity. It was the sheer, crushing weight of helplessness. She was mourning a life too young to understand why love wasn't enough to save it. Jonas didn't offer empty promises. He knew words were cheap in a place like this. Instead, he took the sealed letter and pressed it firmly into her palms. I've done everything I can, he said. If they still won't listen, I'll force them to. She looked up at him, then really looked at him. She didn't see the man who had failed her anymore. She saw a man who had fallen and chosen to get back up. I don't care what happens to me, she said, her fingers clutching the letter like a lifeline. But if they take her, it'll be like she died twice. He nodded. In the quiet of that cell, the distance between them vanished. Something unspoken bound them tighter than the stone walls ever could. They weren't waiting for a miracle to save them anymore. They were forging one themselves. It was barely dawn, the sky a bruised purple, when the impossible happened. A creaking carriage, coated in layers of thick prairie dust, rolled slowly into the center of Calico Ridge. The townspeople, who were already gathering outside the courthouse for the final hearing, stopped their murmuring and turned to watch. The horses halted with a weary snort. The door opened, and three figures stepped out into the cold morning air. It was Henry and Lillian Montrose, flanked by a man in a sharp dark suit carrying a leather briefcase, their lawyer. The Montroses looked like ghosts. They were gaunt and pale, their eyes hollowed out by weeks of running and hiding. But despite their exhaustion, there was a clarity in their gaze, a determination carved from guilt and the long, hard road back home. Henry walked straight up the courthouse steps, turned to face the crowd, and raised his voice. We are here to confess. The silence that fell over the square was total. It was as if the wind itself had stopped. The town council members, the minister, and the very citizens who had spat at Elsie's feet just days ago all turned to stare at the man they had once treated like royalty. Henry cleared his throat. His voice shook, but he forced it steady. We left this town to escape the law, he admitted. I falsified land deeds. I knew the investigation was closing in. He scanned the crowd until his eyes locked onto Jonas, and then Elsie, who was being led out by the guards. In our desperation, Henry continued, we did something unforgivable. We asked Miss Holloway to protect our daughter. We asked her to hide the child because she was the only person we trusted. And then, we abandoned her. We let her carry the weight of our sins so we could save our own skins. Lillian, standing beside him, let out a sob. She stepped down from the platform and walked across the square. straight toward Elsie. Without a word, she wrapped her arms around the younger woman. "I am so sorry," Lillian whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I am begging for it anyway." Elsie stood frozen, stunned by the sudden embrace. Slowly, hesitantly, she placed her hands on Lillian's back for just a moment before stepping away. The square remained dead silent. There was no cheering, no shouting, just a stunned, heavy stillness. From somewhere deep in the crowd, a woman's voice broke the quiet. "We tied an angel to a pole." The legal proceedings unraveled in minutes. The council convened right there on the steps. There was nothing left to argue. The charges against Elsie were dropped immediately. The letter Jonas had tried to present was validated on the spot. The Montresses signed a formal affidavit, and the judge's carriage was halted before it even reached the town limits. There would be no trial. Jonas stood off to the side, watching. The townspeople looked at him differently now. Their eyes were complex, filled with a mix of shame and curiosity. He wasn't just the quiet rancher anymore. The rumor about who he really was, Henry Montres's illegitimate son, would live on. It would be whispered in saloons and stitched into gossip circles for years. The brand of bastard wouldn't fade quickly, but as Jonas stood there, he realized he no longer cared. He didn't bow his head to it. Elsie, too, didn't look triumphant. She stood tall, but there was no gloating in her eyes, only immense relief. As the crowd began to drift away, ashamed to meet her gaze, she walked over to the old town minister. Her voice was soft, but trembled slightly. "I didn't lie," she said simply. "I just couldn't shout louder than your judgment." The minister took off his hat, looking down at the ground. "And yet," he said quietly, "you never stopped standing." Minutes later, Jonas found her standing beneath the old elm tree near the jailhouse, the same spot where they had spent their darkest hours. His eyes were wet, and for the first time in his adult life, he didn't try to hide it. "I cried when I buried my dog as a boy," he said, staring at the tree bark. "Then never again, until today." Elsie reached out and took his hand. Jonas turned, looking at the few townspeople still lingering, watching them. He raised his voice, clear and sure this time. "She was called a liar. I let the truth stay silent, and I promise you, I will never do that again." He paused, then turned back to look Elsie in the eye. "I want to walk beside you," he said. "Not ahead of you, not behind you, beside you." She didn't smile. The moment was too heavy for that. But she squeezed his hand tight and didn't let go. In that moment, the truth finally belonged to them. Not because it had been shouted from the rooftops, but because they had carried it through the fire together. A year had come and gone. Blackstone Ranch didn't look quite the way it used to. The fences were a patchwork quilt of mismatched timber. The barn leaned a little to the east like it was tired but happy, and the paint on the porch was peeling under the sun. But the silence, that heavy, lonely silence that used to hang over the place, was gone completely. Now, the air was filled with the sound of children's laughter spilling out from the back fields, mixed with the clatter of water buckets and the rhythmic tapping of wooden clogs on the floorboards. It wasn't just a ranch anymore. It had become a sanctuary, a rural nursery, and a medical outpost. Built from salvaged lumber and sheer stubbornness. It was paid for with the past. Jonas had sold every single one of his prize breeding mares, wiping away 10 years of work in a single afternoon. No one in town asked him why he did it. They just looked at what he built in exchange and tipped their hats. Elsie was the heart of the operation. She spent her days treating coughs, stitching up farm accidents, and bandaging scraped knees. When the harvest slowed down, she taught reading to children who had never held a book in their lives. She never asked for a title. She wasn't a doctor or a certified teacher. She was just there, constant and capable. Jonas was the hands of the place. He worked the fields, kept the roof from leaking, and cooked dinner when Elsie was too busy to stop. Every night, he sat by the oil lamp and wrote in a journal, though he never showed a soul what was inside. And then there was the child, the little girl the Montresses had left behind, now a toddler with bouncing curls and a laugh that could brighten the darkest room. She wobbled through the kitchen, calling Elsie Ma and Jonas Pa. They never married. There was no church ceremony, no legal documents, no signature on a dotted line binding them together. But the people of Calico Ridge stopped asking questions a long time ago. Everyone understood what that little house on the ridge represented. It was a home built by choice, not by blood or law. It was three people who had every reason to run away, choosing instead to stay. Inside the clinic, hanging right above the worn bookshelf, was a simple wooden frame. Inside it was the letter, the original one, water-stained and creased, the very paper the town had once called a forgery. One afternoon, a young boy waiting for cough syrup pointed at it. "Is that magic paper?" he asked. Elsie looked at it and smiled softly. "No," she said. "It just needed someone to believe in it, and someone brave enough to lose everything to prove it was real." The boy nodded solemnly, accepting the answer even if he didn't quite understand the cost. Jonas made his own final gesture when spring arrived. He went down to the center of town, to the exact spot where Elsie had been chained and judged a year prior. He didn't make a speech. He simply dug a hole and planted a white elm tree. At its base, he set a small wooden plaque he had carved himself. It read, "The truth stood here once, and we nearly let it die." People stopped by often. Some left wildflowers, others just touched the rough bark and walked on. No one dared to remove the plaque. They remembered, and that was enough. In the quiet of the evenings, when the cicadas began to hum and the lanterns glowed warm in the nursery windows, Jonas would sit beside Elsie on the porch. The little girl, Hope, would be asleep in Elsie's lap, and the world, usually so loud and demanding, would soften for a while. One evening, Elsie turned to him, her voice low. "Do you ever miss it? The horses, the auctions, being the man everyone looked up to?" Jonas looked out at the setting sun, then turned to look at her. "I thought I'd miss being a man people respected," he admitted. "But I was wrong." He paused, a small smile touching his lips. "I realized I didn't miss the applause. I missed being the kind of man who actually deserved it." She nodded, resting her head on his shoulder. Nothing more needed to be said. They had learned the hard way that truth didn't need to be shouted to be real. It just needed to be protected. And love didn't start with a vow at an altar. It started with the bravest thing a person could do, staying when it would be easier to leave. If this story moved you, hit that like button and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories. We're here to tell the tales where truth costs everything and love shows up without asking for permission. Jonas stayed silent too long, and Elsie stood alone too long. But in the end, they chose each other not by promise, but by presence. What would you have done in Jonas's boots? Leave a comment below, share your thoughts, and stick around for more stories from the wild, tender heart of the West. Until next time, ride steady and love braver.